Right, good morning and hello. I am going to explain to you the cerebrum. This is the sixth and final region of the brain that we are going to need to cover. One of the things that you should understand are the different lobes as we talk about the cerebrum. So, hopefully, at this point, you understand that there is a frontal lobe. That frontal lobe is on your screen now, highlighted in the dusty blue color. Okay, it's on the left hand side of your screen there. Your occipital lobe is the second photo, and it shows the occipital lobe represented in red, or like a brick red, towards the back of the brain, right, to the posterior of the brain. We then have the parietal lobe, which is going to be between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe, but not all the way to the base of the brain. Okay, so the parietal lobe is, again, that back-ish region of your brain, and it's above the temporal lobe. The last picture there is of the temporal lobe, and it's highlighted in that light green. Okay, so when we talk about the functions of the brain, we're going to be talking about the different areas where they are located. And so when we refer to the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, or temporal lobe, you're going to have an idea of which region of the brain we're talking about. Okay, now please remember, in this brain, we're only looking at half. Think about which half we're looking at. If you said the left side of the brain, that would be correct. And all of this would be repeated on the right side. Okay, so we are looking at a side view of the brain right here. Okay, and then when we take it into a animated or a diagram of it, you can see the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital lobe all there together. And they labeled the cerebellum and the brainstem as well. Hopefully you have an idea about what those do. And if you look at the bottom diagram, you'll see the regions of the brain and what we know about where different functions of the brain come from. Okay, so we are going to spend time today talking about all of these different regions, and it should go kind of quickly. I will tell you that the cerebral cortex is considered to be the gray matter that is on the surface of the brain. So the frontal lobe is going to be made of a layer of gray matter, and then underneath will be that layer of white matter. All right. So you should know that your cerebrum is what allows you to be conscious. It's what allows you to have thought. It's what allows you to think and problem solve. I am hoping that you watched the video where it talked about the development of the brain and how animals have smaller cerebrums. We have a larger cerebrum, and that's what allows us to be intelligent creatures. Okay, so what makes us intelligent? The ability to perceive, the ability to reason, problem solve, understand, appreciate, right? So when we talk about life and we talk about the things that are important, you're using your cerebral cortex in order to make these decisions. All right. I will tell you that your cerebral cortex uses a huge amount of information, and that it's only a small portion of your brain itself, but yet it takes up a huge amount of the nutrients and energy and so forth that you use. Okay, so right now I am very quickly trying to find my file that has the information about that. I apologize, I was not ready. Here we go. The brain has an extraordinary high demand for blood. It is only 2% of our total body weight, but it needs 20% of our blood supply. If the blood flow to the brain is interrupted for only 10 seconds, we lose consciousness. If the blood flow to the brain is interrupted for longer than 10 seconds, cells will not receive enough oxygen or nutrients, and the brain cells can suffer severe tissue damage. And when this happens, we do call it a stroke. All right, so super important to know that all of this is dependent on the blood supply that we get to the different regions. This is the image that is in your textbook. It is accessible to you. It does show all the different regions, and the different numbers are related to the explanations in the textbook. But I just want you to know that it's there for you if you need it. Now, some people believe that most of your brain development will happen in the first few years of your life. And scientists are now starting to understand that that is not the case. I did put a TED Talk on the agenda, and that TED Talk talks about the fact that when you're a child, you're learning more all the time. And that is what drives your brain development. So in the TED Talk, she talks about the fact that the brain is like plastic. It's moldable, it's changeable. And as we get older, we tend to not learn new things. And if we were to continue on the same path that we were on when we were developing as children, our brain would continue to change over time. So remember that, your cerebrum here is responsible for so much, really, really, really important to understand all of these different regions of the brain and how the brain works. All right. And just some more information about the neurons in your brain. 2/3 are in your cerebral cortex. 2/3 of the neurons are in just that outer layer of your brain. Okay, remember that the gray matter doesn't have those myelinated axons, and this allows them all to be more connected in the brain. Very, very interesting. Okay, so we are going to start to try to focus on the things that we understand most. And the thing that we probably understand most is our ability to move. And we are going to be looking at the section labeled the primary motor cortex. And the primary motor cortex is number 4 here on your screen. And it runs from the top of your brain all the way down to your temporal lobe. Okay? And when we look at it, it's divided into certain sections. So right now I'm just going to look on the left-hand side of my screen because we're talking about the motor cortex right now. Your motor cortex is what's going to control movements of your skeletal muscles. It's going to control your ability to talk. It's going to control your ability to speak, to understand, to speak, okay? Now the one thing that I'd like you to notice there, that how much space is devoted to the feeling in your arm. So notice it goes from shoulder to elbow to wrist to hand to fingers to thumb. And I want you to notice that, a good 1/6, if I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if I were to kind of try to break this up here, right? Your fingers and your face take up a huge amount of your cerebral cortex. And that is because we have so many muscles that we control in here. Okay, think about the dexterity we have for fine motor coordination, the way your brain would have to stimulate your fingers to thread a needle, the fact that we can feel so much with our tongue, right? When you put something in your mouth, this is why kids put everything in their mouth, because they're trying to experience it the best they know how. And animals without fingers put stuff in their mouth so that way they can feel it. Okay, very, very interesting. Your tongue is there to help. So that's the motor cortex, and sure enough, doctors can actually go into your head. Neuroscientists can actually, if they were doing brain surgery on you, they could go in and tickle a region of your brain, and they could cause your fingers to move. Very strange, but they can do it. And this is how the technology works when you see, people's heads all wired up and then they have a mechanical arm. Say they lost an arm. They're trying to reconnect the neurons to the machine. Very, very interesting. And this technology is definitely groundbreaking. I don't know what else to call it. If we can control objects with our brain, it's very, very cool. So let's go back and let's look at what's right next to the primary motor cortex. Right next to the primary motor cortex, we are going to get the primary sensory cortex. I'm going to call this the sensory cortex for simplification, okay? Because that's all we really need to know. And the sensory cortex goes right along with the motor cortex. And so now this is shown on the right side of the screen. These are the things that you sense. When somebody touches your head, you feel it in here. If somebody touches your arm, you feel it in here. When you're using your hands and your fingers, you feel it in here. Look at how much space is devoted to your eye. These folds and wrinkles account for the development of those parts. Okay, and then you have your nose, your face, your lips, your teeth, gum, jaw, tongue, your pharynx. And then here, all of this right here is all gaining sensations from your abdominal area. Okay, so when you're feeling abdominal pain and you're feeling things move through your digestive system, you're feeling them here. All right, so this right here is what gives you the sensation that, hey, I need to poop, which is interesting, right? Okay. So those are our two cortexes, and the motor cortex is going to get us to move, and the sensory cortex is what we're feeling. So let's say, for example, you feel something that's hot and you feel it over here. Well, the corresponding region on the brain is very close. It's right on the other side, so that way you can move it away to protect yourself, okay? And these are what we're going to call reflexes. I just realized now that you might not understand this chart exactly. I want you to imagine that this, to the top left of your screen here, that the blue and the red are like pieces of cake. I know, cake, brain, kind of strange, but let's imagine that we cut these and we put them on a plate, and then we pushed the red to the left and we pushed the blue to the right. So we're opening it up and seeing. So when I say that the hand and the fingers are right next to each other, that's because they would be right next to each other, okay? In the brain, they are right next to each other. All right, so you should have already recorded these notes, but this is the part that it goes with. The primary motor cortex is what controls your movements, the movement of your mouth, the movement of your eyes, the movement of your diaphragm, creating speech. Okay, and this in the lab is what we were talking about. If something damages that primary motor area, is it more likely to cause vision loss or paralysis? Well, it's going to cause paralysis. All right, so you might notice right now that vision is in your occipital lobe. All right, your occipital lobe is where we have vision. So this is why those questions were asked in the lab. Okay, your primary sensory cortex, right? This is where we are going to get that awareness of hot, cold, pressure, pain, all right? And then it can send the signals, as I said, to the motor cortex if needed. Now, strangely enough, your primary sensory cortex doesn't recognize things. Your primary sensory cortex must use an association area to connect the different parts of the cortex. So this is where we get the recognition of things. So if you started to smell something, you might say, oh my gosh, I forgot I put something in the oven, and you recognize it as a burning smell, right? If you, again, walk through the door and mom's making your favorite meal, you are going to recognize the smell that goes along with it. Okay, when you put it in your mouth, you're going to taste it. You're going to be able to associate that with previous experience. Okay, now quite interesting, there's a number of examples of these association areas. All right, and these association areas have 4 different areas that you should have already recorded. If you haven't, you can pause the video and do it now. That's fine. Okay. You have a somatic sensory area, which is going to allow you to determine texture, shape, and size. So, really interesting. If you were to stick your hand underneath the couch looking for something you dropped, you know, as you're feeling under the couch and you're not actually looking at what you're touching, you know, you might find something else under the couch. Oh, wow, I found the TV remote. And before you even pull it out from under the couch, your somatic sensory association area has identified what it is by the shape, size, and texture. Okay, so I used to do this with the students. I would walk around and I would put something in a bowl. Usually I would put a pair of scissors in the bowl. And I would ask the students to just feel what is in the bowl. And once you've identified what it is just by touch, you know, pull your hand out of the bowl. And sure enough, I've never had a student reach into the bowl and feel a pair of scissors and not be able to identify that those in fact were scissors. Okay, so that's your somatic sensory association area. Your visual association area is going to have you recognize ideas, all right? And when we recognize ideas, you know, the things that you recognize are apples, cars, your mom, your brother, your dog. Okay, so when we see something and we know it, that is because we have stimulated our visual association area. So if you had damage to your visual association area, you wouldn't be able to recognize things. And sure enough, there's a story told about a man who had damage to his visual association area, and he wasn't able to recognize his own children. And crazy enough, that's where his auditory association area would kick in. His auditory association, of course, is going to recognize sounds. And if his kids spoke, he would recognize their voices, but looking at their face, he would not recognize their face. Super crazy how the brain works. And the more we learn, the more we know we don't know. It is an ongoing study, so I do imagine that just like finding out that our brains are like plastic and that if we continue to use them throughout our life, they will continue to change. We will update our beliefs and our facts. I shouldn't say beliefs. We will update our facts as we move through the discovery of science. Okay, so your association, your auditory association area is going to also be stimulated when you hear like the school bell, which we don't hear school bells any longer, but you get the idea. If you hear, you know, police sirens, you know, when you're driving, you're supposed to pull over. When you hear your favorite song on the radio, okay? So all of these things are controlled or stored in your auditory association area. The last thing on this list is your premotor cortex, and your premotor cortex is where we store learned motor skills from repetitive patterns. So when you think about learning to play a musical instrument, when you start learning how to use your keyboard and do something we used to call typing, I changed it to keyboarding. That's funny. In my old one, it says typing. So keyboarding, a musical instrument, as well as athletics. Now, in the TED Talk that's listed as a supplemental video, if you'd like to watch, she talks about why is it that when we practice something and we think we know it, we come back later and find out that, oh my gosh, we forgot how to do that. So let's say we're learning a new task. We're learning how to miniature golf. We're learning how to shoot a golf ball with a putter into the little hole, and we practice. Not so good. Our first shot, not so good, too hard. Our second shot, not hard enough. Our third shot, closer. Our fourth shot, much better. Our fifth shot, wow, we got it in the hole. Okay, so you take a number of times to get it right. Now, once you've had that fifth shot and it's in the hole, well, your sixth shot's in the hole, your seventh shot's in the hole, your eighth shot's in the hole. And you're like, wow, okay, I got this. You do 5 more, they're all in the hole. And you're thinking, okay, I don't need to practice this anymore. I have this, And so then you go home the next day, the big test comes up, your challenge, I don't know, you're going to win $10 for hitting the ball into the hole. You walk up and you hit the ball and everything you learned has been forgotten. And that is because of how our brain functions with short-term and long-term memory. That's why I ask you for spaced repetition. That's why I keep going back and having you practice the different things that you've learned about this unit over and over again. And no, they're not going to your premotor cortex, because your premotor cortex is about motor skills. But there's another cortex in your brain that's associated with learning new things. Okay, and so I want you to understand that it's the same principle. When you dedicate enough time to something, your body will store it in long-term memory, not just short-term memory. Okay? So if you want to make sure that you know a skill, you have to practice it over and over and over. And if you belong to a sports team, you understand this, that every time you go to practice, the coach has you doing the same drills. Okay, and again, those are going to come out during the game. When you make that shot, you are going to have it in your long-term memory. You are going to remember where your foot position should be, where your hand position should be, whatever. When you're playing a musical instrument, again, same thing, right? Your fingers know how to do it one day. You practice it over and over. You come back the next day and you're not so good at it again, okay? So practice, 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 super, super important, all right? So we have a bunch of different areas. We still need to identify where these things are processed. And those are going to be our central or cerebral processing centers. All right, and these are the things that are going to be kind of spread out through your brain. We're not really exactly sure which part of the brain controls these, and I think that, quite honestly, in different people, they're stored in different areas. We do know that if an area of your brain gets damaged, you can train another area of your brain to take control of that area. So very, very crazy. But in order to process what we learn from the sensory cortex and send it to the motor cortex, we have to have these interpretation areas. So we call them processing centers. And these are areas of the cortex working together, all right? So the general interpretive area is going to allow us to be able to interpret what we see, what we hear, all right? And then be able to even follow directions. So if I say the example, sit here. Well, I'm at the other end of a computer and you're not really sure, what do I mean, sit here? Now, if we were in the classroom and I had my hand out and I was holding my hand above a chair and I was gesturing to that chair and said, sit here, that would imply that you understand that I am making a motion and a gesture of where you should sit, that you understand the concept of sit. And so then your general interpretive area helps you understand this idea of sit here. Another processing center that we have is our prefrontal cortex. And our prefrontal cortex is the most complicated part of our brain. This is where we sort out concepts that would be considered abstract. So love, hate, judgment calls. When we make judgments about things, we have to use our prefrontal cortex. We have to decide, is that good or bad? We have to decide, is that something that, we're for or against? Same idea, all right? And then the reasoning comes in. Well, okay, I know that I shouldn't do this. I know that mom says that I shouldn't be here or there or whatever. But the reason I'm going to is because. And this part of your brain right now is not fully developed. You all are teenagers. And we know that your prefrontal cortex doesn't completely develop until you're about 25. And that magic number was calculated, and it's been used, and it is used in different forms of business that you might not think about. If you've ever tried to rent a car, well, you need a driver's license and you need to be 25 years old. Crazy, 25 to rent a car? You have to be 25 to rent a car because the insurance companies, through statistical analysis, have recognized and realized that if you are under 25, you are more likely to crash your car. And therefore, car rental agencies don't want to rent to you. Okay, this is the same idea of why children do reckless things, why children have a hard time. I say children, undeveloped adults. You guys at 17 and 18, 19, 20, you guys are adults, but you are unfinished adults. Your prefrontal cortex has not finished developing, okay? So your ideas, your abstract ideas, your judgment and your reasoning are what we as older adults would consider to be poor. And that's not a diss on anybody. It's just a fact, okay? Now, there are some teenagers that will have better reasoning and judgment than full-grown adults, and that would be just a more developed prefrontal cortex, okay? So this is another reason why some people will recommend, some psychologists, psychiatrists, whatever, mental health professionals will recommend that you don't get married until after you're 25 because your judgment and reasoning changes from the time you're 20 till the time you're 25. And thank God it does, because when I was 20, I thought I knew it all and I understood life and I was, smarter than the average bear. I didn't have much schooling for my record, but I always knew that I was fairly intelligent. But as I got older and as life has progressed, I was much different at the end of my 20s than I was at the beginning. So your prefrontal cortex, very, very important. I want to say in pre-knowledgeable science, they used to do something called lobotomies. And a lobotomy is shown here in this picture. Scientists believe that if you had bad judgment or reasoning, that they could scramble the front part of your prefrontal cortex and leave all of your, vital functionings of the brain intact, but they would be able to take away your judgment and reasoning, or your poor judgment and reasoning. And this picture is so horrific. You hopefully see the person laying on the gurney. You'll see the nurse holding the arms down. You'll see the doctor with the bare arms. And he's got like a little mallet in his hand. And what is not very clear in this picture is that he has a probe going up this patient's nostril. And he is going to tap through to that frontal lobe of the brain, and then he is going to move that probe around, disconnecting the neurons that are there. Now, please notice that none of these people are wearing surgical gear. Nobody has a face mask on. We were very, very ignorant for a very long time about the human body and medicine and how it all works. Rose Kennedy was President John F. Kennedy's oldest sister. When their mother was in labor, the nurse wasn't, the doctor wasn't there, and the child was trapped in the birth canal, and it caused brain damage. And the oldest Kennedy daughter was never quite right. Her father set up and had a frontal lobotomy performed on her as one of the most famous people that ever had a frontal lobotomy. And the poor girl never had a life. If you read about Rose Kennedy, it's a very, very sad story. But she's one of the reasons why we know that frontal lobotomies don't work and that we should not do that to people. So if you're interested, you can look that up, read the story. There's a lot of other stories in I keep wanting to just say pre-medieval medicine, but it seemed evil. But it wasn't evil. People were learning, people were trying things, and sure enough, it's because of those mistakes of the past that we know as much as we do. So mistakes in our lives should be seen as learning opportunities. We usually have a negative connotation of mistakes, but I would say that we should not. Okay, please notice that Speech Center is also there on the bottom as one of the processing centers. This allows us to produce speech. We're able to use the words that we have learned from other things that are stored in other regions of the brain. Your speech center is what's going to allow you to put those thoughts together and have your thoughts come out as words. Okay, have your thoughts come out and have them make sense. Okay, so please do not forget that your cerebrum is made of white matter and gray matter. The white matter are going to be those myelinated axons that connect the other neurons, allow the transmission to move very, very quickly. Okay. And then the gray matter is where all of our facts are stored. Okay. So one thing that I'd like you to look at here is notice where there's more white matter on the surface. So according to this picture, this would be the right side of the brain that has more white matter and the left side of the brain that's labeled. And interestingly enough, I would guess that this person is left-handed. The right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. And they notice when they do brain examinations of right-handed people, the left side of their brain is more developed. Left-handed people have a more developed right side of the brain. And if you're ambidextrous, meaning that you use both hands, then you have equally developed brain sections. Okay, so hopefully you already have this written down. Again, the cerebral white matter is going to connect the other areas of the brain, and it's got that myelin in order to make those transmissions extremely fast. So hopefully you will remember all of the sections of your cerebrum. Okay, the frontal lobe, think about looking at this picture. Where is the frontal lobe? Think about where is the occipital lobe. And then right through the middle of the brain here, you would have your sensory and motor cortexes. All right, to the back of the brain is where we're going to have vision. We didn't really talk much about hearing, and I will tell you that your hearing is located in your temporal lobes, okay, right above your ears, very close to your ears. All right. If you have questions about the cerebrum, please make sure that you ask. Please make sure that you get all of your questions asked, and that will conclude our lecture on the cerebrum. Thank you for watching.